In this demo, we're going to be creating a double click interaction. This is the final result that we'll be working towards. When we double click, a little heart appears in a similar way that you would expect on social media. Let's start from scratch. Now we've already got the artboard with the heart, and we have a timeline where the heart's already animated. The animation is created with a bunch of scale keys to create the bounce effect. You'll see that the scale keys create a bounce in effect, and then we pause, and then the heart disappears. Now, let's go back to design mode and make some changes so that we can create the double click effect. The first thing that we're going to do is create a large square. This square we'll use as a hitbox later. Now, after we center it, let's go ahead and change the color from gray to red, and we're going to rename this hitbox. Remember, we don't need the visibility of the hitbox for it to actually work in the end, so we can go ahead and hide it. Now that we're back in animate mode, we're going to need to add an input and a listener. So let's start by adding the input first. And in this case, we're going to use a trigger. And we're going to rename the trigger tap. Now, to trigger the trigger, we're going to use a listener. So let's open up the listeners panel, select our hitbox, and then click on the plus button. Remember, using this process automatically selects a target for our listener. Now let's change the listener type from pointer inner to pointer down. When this interaction happens, we want to have our tap trigger fire. Now what we'd expect to see is that anytime we click on our hitbox, the tap trigger will fire. Now let's work with the states in our state machine graph. If we play the current version of our state machine, you'll notice that our bounce animation plays right away. And this is because we only have a single animation. What we'll need to do is create a new state where our state machine is waiting for a click. And we'll also need another state where it's waiting for the second click before it actually fires off the bounce animation. So for this, we're going to need to create a new animation and call it idle. Now we can go back to our state machine and add our new animation. Now in its current setup, we're starting in the bounce animation, but we actually want to start in the idle state. So we can delete our first transition and then create a new one from the entry state to the idle state. If we were to start the state machine now, our state machine would simply go into the idle state and then wait. But as we said before, we want it to wait for a click and then go into another idle state. So we'll need to add a new version of this idle animation. Now we need to create a transition between both idle animations. Once we configure it, this will allow us to go from one idle to the next on the tap trigger. Now let's test our state machine and see if our current setup's working. You'll notice that our state machine waits in the first idle state until we click our mouse where it sits in the next one. Now we need to create a transition between our second idle state and the bounce animation. Now we need to configure this transition to work the same as the others, so that it happens after we use the tap trigger. Because we want this interaction to happen over and over, we also need to create a loop. So we need to hook the bounce animation to that first idle animation. But we don't want our transition to happen automatically. We want it to play the entire animation, so let's use the exit time and set an exit time of 100%. Now let's test the state machine to make sure it works. After the first click, we transition to the idle animation, and after the second one, our reaction plays, and we're back to the first idle. Now if we click again, we're back to idle, and then we're back to the reaction. Now everything seems like it works, but what else could we do to improve this? Well, we could set a maximum time in which you can do both clicks, so that if you take too long on the first click, it'll actually reset back to the first idle animation. To achieve this, we can create another transition from the second idle animation back to the first, and then we can define some sort of time that has to pass before it'll go back. In this case, we can use exit time and set it to 100% so that we have the length of the timeline to complete that second click. After our first click, we'll have a total time of 1 second to click again, or else we'll transition from the second idle back to the first one. As a reminder, that 1 second comes from the duration of the timeline. We could change it if we wanted, but for now we'll leave it the same. Now, as long as that second click happens before the idle animation runs out, we should go to our bounce animation. Let's try it out. You'll notice that when we click, it'll go to the idle animation, and since we didn't click again, we've jumped back to the first one. Let's see that again. Now let's make sure our double click actually works. And it seems like it does. Now again, if we wanted to change how long we have to make that second click, we just need to change the duration of this timeline. Right now it's set on a second, but we can make it 2 seconds, or we can shorten it and make it something like a half a second. Before we wrap things up, let's fix one small detail. If we start our state machine now, you can see the heart until we actually use the double click interaction. You'll notice that on the second loop, the heart actually starts hidden, which is what we're looking for. As a reminder, the properties that we're changing is the scale of the heart. It both starts and ends at a 0% scale. So we need to add that 0% key to the idle animation. So we're just going to set a 0% key for the X and a 0% key for the Y, and that should fix our issue. Now let's go back to the state machine and test to see if that fixed things. When we play the state machine, you'll see that the heart isn't appearing until we actually make the double click, which is exactly what we're looking for.